Welcome to this edition of Education as It Happens. I'm particularly pleased that my guest in the studio today is Professor Henk Schmidt from Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, if I have that right. He is also a Professor of Psychology and has been involved in research in cognitive psychology since 1974, and shares that same passion for psychology and learning that many of us share for learning in education. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to Henk about today, and I'm going to put you on the spot, I know I like to do that with folks, Henk, if I could make you in charge of that educational process worldwide, but if you want to go smaller in your country, what would one of the things that you would be putting into place right away in order to effect the learning system or the learning process? You know, it's a wish list. I mean, just imagine that if I can wish it and it will be, this is what will happen.
Okay, let's assume that I'm, for the time being, the Minister of Education in my country.
Perfect.
You mean something like that?
Something like that. You just know that you have a sense of what should happen, and you're going to make it happen, and you've got the opportunity to do that.
Okay. First, I would do some conservative things. I would try to reinstall respect for the basic skills that every human being should have. Everybody should learn to write properly, to speak properly, to do arithmetic, to be able to count and compute. These skills, at least in my country, are now neglected. So we end up with students in the university system that cannot spell, that make terrible mistakes. So I'm going to help restore that. And then I would.
Is there anything about the learning process that
we've
got that? Have we tooled that incorrectly?
Yes. I'm going to stop to a large extent direct teaching. So now let me give you an example. You know, in high school I spent 6 hours of my day sitting in a classroom listening to somebody. And then if it was not yet enough, then I had to do 4 hours of homework. You know, partly the same things that he was talking about. And I have never understood this. I was bored to death these 6 hours. Of course there were some...
Welcome to the club.
Of course there were some good teachers there, you know, and these are the teachers that you never forget. Yeah. And these are the teachers that are mentioned as those, you know, everybody should be that way. And if you would have such teachers, your education would be fine. I would believe that, but there are only few that have that particular talent to be remembered even after 20 or 30 years. Most teachers wrestle with this task. They find it very difficult. In the past, when I was young, maybe when you were young, we were too polite to make a lot of hassle in the classroom. So at least it was silent.
I was a little mischievous, I can recall, because boredom breeds mischief.
Okay. Now I was daydreaming, so you know.
I was looking out the window, thinking, "Oh my God, when is this going to end?"
That's right. I was looking at my watch all the time. You know, another 5 minutes gone. So these teachers were and are wrestling. They are telling stories, sometimes very good stories, interesting stories. Sometimes they help you really understand the difficult things of the profession. But most of the time it is a poor summary of what is in the books. And the problem is also that they present it at their pace. Whereas learning, you know, if I were able to read what they were saying, I can do it at my own pace. And I can, you know, reread parts. I can summarize parts. All of this cannot happen. And can you imagine, most of the day I spent on activities that were not very useful for my learning. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to forbid direct instruction. I would say, listen, we are going to focus on the activity of the student. The student has to be active. He has to read. And now, how can we get him to read? How can we get him to do the things he needs to do on a daily basis? In university education, there's another problem. There are not too many lectures anymore. There's a lot of time for self-study, but students do not use the self-study. They postpone. They wait until the examination. And when the examination comes up, they are too late. So they fail, and they have to redo it. So how can you organize your curriculum such that the focus is on the activity of the students? The students have to do the reading and the finding of materials, the use of the IT, etc. But they have to do it in a structure that enables them, that encourages them to do this on a daily basis. So activity and structure. And for the structure, the teacher is responsible. He is not going to teach directly anymore, but he gives assignments. And he will discuss these assignments with them on a daily basis, so they really have to do it every day. So I don't have to go to school for 6 hours and then do homework for 4 hours. I work for 5 or 6 hours on assignments, and the teacher takes care that I do that every day. That is my ideal.
That's your ideal.
Yeah.
How do we engage the students today? We're dealing with a whole different mindset. We're dealing with what we call I call them the digital millennium students. Mark Prensky has made a career out of calling them the digital natives, which I take exception to. But the idea is that they're very, very different. They're touch and go surface learners, used to rapid stimulation. It's like a very Skinnerian kind of like boom, trigger, response. I like it, I'm going to do it. How do we deal with that? Have you, in your long study in the psychology of learning, you have anything that you think could work?
You should realize learning is not in itself a rewarding affair. I mean, the results of learning can be very rewarding, but the activity itself requires effort, and people tend to avoid effort. So this is the main reason that people, would skip over things, would stop far earlier than is required for a deep understanding of the things that they are trying to learn. This all has to do with the fact that learning requires effort, and we tend to avoid. This is a natural thing. This is not because we are lazy, but this is the way we are built. We are just-in-time managers. We do things at the latest moment that is possible, and we do them at a low level of effort as possible. Nevertheless, there are activities that really engulf students, that really draw them into it. And they tend to have to do with interesting, authentic tasks. Things that have personal meaning for them, that changes their lives as it is now here, that are funny, that can be done together with other people. These things really help in getting them involved in their own learning. And then IT, the internet, the things that we produce can play an important and interesting role.
One of the things that I hear oftentimes, especially in the university environment, is that I can't always make my mathematical equation or my electrical engineering schemata relate to the real world. How do you respond to those to that mindset? Because that's really a challenge. They'll argue, and I'm not in a position to say, well, no, that's not true, because I haven't taught that subject at that level. I fundamentally agree with you. I think that you have to find real-world, authentic contexts to engage students. And that's your primary job as an educator. I feel that to the bottom of my heart, that if you can't do that, then you really shouldn't be in that classroom. Now, of course, we are a research-oriented university, and many researchers don't want to do teaching, but that's part and parcel of what transmits our story. down through time is that research and that good teaching, or that cultivation of the environment to produce the flowers that are going to carry us forward. And I think those are the young, bright minds that are going to, help us move this. I like to think of it as carrying a torch.
Yes.
And they keep that flame lit and pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah.
Well, there is this argument all the time that I get. Well, I can't make everything contextually. Do you get that? How do you respond to it if you do?
I don't mind. Maybe that is true. Maybe sometimes there are subjects that you cannot deal with in the way you described, our favorite way, authenticity, real life stuff, context. Maybe there is, and then we have to adapt. We cannot force teachers who are not able to bring their material, to present their material in a way that helps learning. We cannot force them into a situation in which they have to. If mathematics cannot be taught in the way that we would prefer, then we have to teach it in the way that they say they should.
Because
as long as we have no alternatives. And it is I have noticed in the 30 years that I'm active in this field, that indeed there is very little idea how you can get students at a high level of mathematics literacy with the help of these real life instruments. So, too bad. I mean,
so dig down, because learning is not always fun.
No, that's right. And if we believe that students have to acquire a specific level of expertise in mathematics, and I think this is self-evident, then let's try to make life not too difficult for them, but then this is the way it has to be done. Devoid of the reality of everyday life. I don't believe in integrating everything with everything. I don't believe in that. There are certain topics that lend themselves very easily to integration with other topics. In medicine, one cannot understand why people ever taught biochemistry and anatomy and physiology separate from each other, because there is a beautiful organizing principle in medicine which is called the human body. If you teach organ systems, if you teach the cardiovascular system, biochemistry of the system, the physiology of the system, the structure, the anatomy of the system, come together in a very natural and beautiful way. So teach integrated. But there are some topics that cannot be integrated in an easy way. So why would we do that? I have I've built a psychology curriculum in Rotterdam, and then people say, it's not integrated. There's a course of social psychology, and here's a course of personality, and here's a course of statistics and methods separately. Why don't you integrate? And then I say, these topics don't lend themselves for integration. These are worlds in itself. And why would I? No. Nevertheless, I use real world tasks for teaching social psychology, as I use real world tasks for teaching.
So when you can, do it. And if you can't, explain why you can't, and you got to just dig down. But that means we'll come to some of this business that you've been sharing with us over the past few days on the business of learning. And you talked about two essential pillars in that process. One was prior recall and elaboration. Do you care to share a little bit about why you feel prior recall of knowledge is so fundamental to this process?
In order to understand very simple things, you need knowledge already of the world. If I tell you that I'm leaving for the Netherlands, and if you really understand what I'm saying, then you bring in a lot of prior knowledge of traveling. You know that it will be a plane, because you cannot reach the Netherlands you know where the Netherlands is, or at least approximately. Yesterday somebody said Helsinki, is that in the Netherlands? One of my colleagues. I can imagine that the Netherlands is a very tiny country, and Europe is also very, very small. But even the understanding of simple messages, like the harbors of Norway are free of ice in the winter, whereas the harbors of Sweden at the same longitude are closed because of the ice. This is a simple fact. But understanding this simple fact requires a lot of prior knowledge. So if you try to teach people new things, you have to stay close where what they already know. Because if you are too far away with your new knowledge, new learning cannot occur. Because they cannot use their prior knowledge in order to make sense out of what you are trying to teach them. So prior knowledge is a requisite for new learning to take place. And of course there are differences in prior knowledge between students. And what you see is that students who come into the university, for instance, with relatively few prior knowledge, and compared to those who have a lot of prior knowledge, they would tend to diverge even further during the training, because those with a lot of prior knowledge profit more from new education than students who have only limited prior knowledge. So prior knowledge is important, but it's only important in the sense that it helps us with the initial understanding of the material. You know, in order to learn something, you have to understand it. If you don't understand the law of Archimedes, you cannot recall it, etc. So it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. It helps you in the initial understanding, but then you have to do something with what you have learned, the new stuff that you have learned, in order to remember it and to be able to use it. So elaboration and rehearsal are two fundamental psychological cognitive processes that are as important as the prior knowledge that you bring in.
So before we move on to the elaboration and what that looks like or can look like, I just want to come back. Now, what was my responsibility as a professor or a lecturer or teacher, however you want to define it, mentor, coach, facilitator, guide, where all of that. What's my responsibility with respect to understanding your prior knowledge?
Of course, as a teacher, you should be very much aware of what people already understand and know about your topic. That is very important. It's a totally neglected part of teaching. That you ask yourself, and in fact try to find out what students already know about a specific topic. This leads in many schools to situations where people teach things that students already know.
So, but you taught this particular math concept last year, and I have new students. I just assume you taught it. I'm going to start off with, can I do that? Should I do that?
I think it's risky. I think you should talk with your colleague.
But I talked to you and you say, yeah, I did.
Yeah. And that's not even enough, because, you know, maybe it was not taught well, or in the meantime they've forgotten about it. So you have to do something with the prior knowledge before you start doing new things. Let's say a period of rehearsal of these ideas, and then start going further on. So that is one task. Another task is to find the learning resources that would adapt to that prior knowledge. So I don't believe in, you know, send people to the internet and let them study there, finding their own resources, because I believe very strongly that the quality of teachers is in the fact that they can find materials that really are helpful when students try to acquire new things. So I think that there's an important role of that teacher.
I think you're talking about the difference between structured and unstructured curriculum, and the role of that. And I've always believed that structured curriculum is part of the process that a civilization or a society or a country uses to perpetuate its sense of its identity in the world. And if you just leave it to unstructured curriculum, there's a bit of a danger in that.
I totally agree. I'm very much in favor of a structured curriculum, not only because of the fact that we perpetuate our culture in our children through this kind of education, but simply because we have to build bridges. And you know, there's a lot of knowledge that has no use in terms of building bridges. And there is some knowledge that is more useful than other in building bridges.
You recall we were having a conversation the other day walking down the car park, and we were chatting about the role of the lecture, and that in fact, you know, we have to admit that in large measure the benefits that we have, the buildings that stay standing, the bridges that stay standing, the transportation systems, the underground systems, all of that is built on the lecture process.
Yes.
And the lecture tutorial model. So while we decry that particular model, we also have to recognize it has some historical validity.
Yeah.
And how do we make that transition, that slippery transition?
Yeah.
Because a lot of professors and a lot of educators and a lot of policymakers will say, "Hey, it's worked well. Why change?"
Yeah. Now let me say something provocatively. You know, I made it despite of these 6 hours of lecturing, because I had 4 hours of self-study. But it means also that I could have been much further in my studies if these lectures, these lessons by these teachers were not in the way and took a lot of my time. I told you also the story that, again, our educational system has been successful. But I firmly believe that with an increased understanding of what learning is really about, it can become far more efficient and far more effective. It can bring our children, our youngsters, much farther than we can bring them now. I told you the story that I discovered that graduation rate in a medical school and the time that students needed to graduate was negatively affected by the number of lectures they gave. The less lectures they gave, the shorter the study duration and the higher the graduation rate. This shows that lectures not only have positive effects on learning. I believe strongly that lectures are very good at conveying personal experiences of people. You know, what I can read in the book, I can read in the book. I can better read in the book than listening to your fleeting thoughts that are away a few minutes after I've heard them. But if you are a good storyteller, and if you have relevant stories to tell me, this can motivate me for your
So this is
fields.
part of the engagement of the learner.
That's right. Lectures very important for. In addition, they can help you understand difficult topics. Some things are so difficult to understand that they need the direct instruction of somebody who understands these things in depth in order to be understood. I believe that indeed it is very difficult to understand the law of Archimedes or Newtonian mechanics by yourself, simply by reading. You need a teacher who is aware of what makes these topics so difficult, and finds situations in which, you know, your prior beliefs will be shuttered by these new ideas. So difficult topics, helping to understand. My father explained things to me that I never could have acquired myself. But there are not too many. There are not so many of these difficult topics. They do not require that you teach for 30 hours in a week, or in my case, even 36 hours in high school, because we had a six day a week. There's no reason for that, really, no reason. And it's a pity for teachers, because, you know, they make a living. Sometimes I believe that many teachers would be glad if they would not, you know, be forced to stand there for 6 hours talking to people who seem clearly, you know, like the young Paul Gagnon is mischievous or is looking out of the window.
Waiting.
Yeah,
waiting.
till
Yeah.
the last...
Well, lunch is in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Let's come back to elaboration, because I'd like you to share a little bit with our audience on the imperative behind this elaboration based on your research and your experiences with this topic.
You know, elaboration has been shown in laboratory studies to be the most potent instrument to help you remember things, but not only remember things, but also to use what you have remembered. Really, there is no stronger cognitive mechanism than elaboration. For instance, I gave you the sentence, I want you to learn a fact. The harbors of Sweden are full of ice in the winter, and Norway, which is the same longitude. Now, how would you deal with this in K-12 education? As a 10-year-old, you would say, okay, let's learn it by heart. So let's rehearse it a couple of times. The harbors in Sweden, the harbors in ice, non-ice, etc. And then you would have a test, and they would say, is there ice in the winter in the harbors of Sweden? And then you would say yes or no. But this is not enough. This is very poor education. Because, what if you would elaborate on this fact, this simple fact, you would say, and now I'm beginning to elaborate. The first would be, what is longitude? And you would try to find out. And you would discover that there is how do you call them? There's longitude and latitudinal lines over the globe, and that longitudinal lines mean that places are at the same height on the globe. And then the second question would be, where are Sweden and Norway exactly? So it would lead you to a map of the world, or a map of Europe, and you would discover...
They would look for the intersection between longitude and latitude.
That's right. And then the third question would be that you should ask yourself, elaborating, why is this fact important? Why is it important to know that the harbors in Sweden and the harbors in... And then you would say to yourself, why are harbors so important? And then you would realize that they play an important economical function, that they are a knot in the transport network, and if in the winter a harbor is not approachable, then the economy will suffer. Yeah? And then the last question would be, why is this so? They are in the same longitude. Why is there ice in the harbors of Sweden? Well, the harbors of Norway remain free. And then you would think of, or you would find out, that there is a Gulf Stream emanating from Mexico.
And I was thinking some smart student might say, well, they must be warm in the harbors of Norway, sir.
So you see how a simple fact, by elaboration, becomes very meaningful. And by doing that, it will be remembered all your life. And the information can be used in many different ways.
So let's jump out right now, because I'm remembering. And you talked a little bit about, in one of your presentations, solidifying the biochemistry, or the synaptics, the neural networks, solidifying those, as opposed to when does that happen? When do they break? How can they break down? Why do they sometimes not solidify, and then we lose those networks? You talked a little bit about that. Remember the concussion?
Yeah. So let's first finish the elaboration bit. 2 days ago, I did a talk, and I gave, I think, 15 digits, numbers.
Yes.
And I helped you, the audience. Yes, and I helped the audience elaborate on it. So no rehearsal, simply elaboration. Do you still remember the numbers?
Oh, yes, I do.
Can
Yeah,
you
14, 1492, 39, 45, 92, and 2003.
You see, even after 2 days, with a little bit of elaboration.
So for our audience, that is the what is it? Pi. The pi is 3.1492.
Etc.
Dot 39. All of that, etc. And that was an example of how we learn, is that we associate what these numbers were, and he walked us through a process of association.
Yes, and now without difficulty you remember them 2 days later, whereas these numbers are random, more or less.
Yes.
So, now, the result of, so learning is first understanding with the help of prior knowledge, then second, elaboration, enrichment of what you have to learn, again using prior knowledge, and the resulting structures are represented in the brain by biochemical structures, by neurotransmitters, by patterns of cells that fire and that produce neurons, that produce hormones in the brain, and these form a certain configuration, and this is essentially your memory of the events. Of course, it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable because everybody knows, if you had an accident at a certain stage and a concussion, when you would try to remember what happened previous to the concussion, you would not remember. You would have lost an hour or so. What happens is that these experiences of that hour were organized in your brain biochemically, but now, because of the blow, these structures were disturbed, and therefore you don't remember. So it is fragile in the beginning, and it needs strengthening. Now, one of the ways of strengthening is take rest. I told the story of people who would sleep for 8 hours after a learning exercise, would remember far more, recall far more from that learning exercise than those people who had the same learning exercise and did not sleep for 8 hours. So sleep, rest, plays an important role in solidifying these structures, but they still remain vulnerable, and they only become less vulnerable by exercise, by using them. So this is why it's so stupid to learn a lot of things and then never come back to it. I'm very much in favor of a curriculum that is less extensive, but concentrates on really the great ideas, and then comes back to these ideas, so that you have the opportunity to come back to these structures and strengthen them by coming back. And eventually these structures, if you use them a lot, become so strong that they take the form not of a biochemical structure, but of a network of dendrites that are connecting with all these cells. And then they cannot be destroyed anymore. Yeah, of course you can have a terrible blow, how do you call it?
You can have a stroke.
You can have a stroke, and then, of course...
or you can get a mad surgeon cutting open your brain, stuff like that.
But apart from that, it is remembered. Harry Barrick has shown that people even remember 60% of what they learned at a certain stage in their life. 60%, even after 50 years. Even after 50 years of non-use, they remembered 60% of what they had learned. And the learning was, for instance, learning Spanish. People who learn Spanish use it even in only 1 or 2 years, quite intensive. Develop these structures that help them survive this knowledge for 60 years.
And so for them to have remembered it, so they've obviously made some very solid neural networks.
Yeah.
Right? The dendrites are inextricably linked. They can get a little musty, or perhaps they get cobwebbed, perhaps, a little bit if they're not used, but they can be reactivated. It's how do we get them there? What is it that's associated with that? And I think we talked a little bit about that. You talked about the value of practice and repetition.
Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't say repetition as such, because varied practice, practice in which you use it in the material in slightly different ways a number of times, is far more effective. But indeed, there is no way out of practice. There is no way out. You cannot become a grandmaster in chess. You cannot become a master internist. You cannot become a top educationalist if you don't practice, if you don't use whatever you have learned and apply it to situations. And you know, internists and chess players have a big advantage over you and me, Paul, because they...
well, they're making more money.
Not a chess player.
Not a chess player. Okay, all right.
Really a poor man's,
well, the big ones, the big guys, right? Yeah.
But they have another advantage over us. They are confronted with problems in their domain on a continuous basis. A doctor sees 40 to 50 patients every day, and every patient is an opportunity to exercise, to practice. Chess players play 10, 20, 30 games a day. They can play it with a computer. They don't need anybody else. They use the little booklets where classic games are described. They play these games. They try to find new solutions to these problems. So they see a lot of problems helping them to practice. I, as an educator, encounter only a few problems a year. For instance, when I am in a position to help a teacher, or to give a PhD students a helping hand. So our possibilities to practice, our opportunities to practice what we have learned in the past are far less. And I fear that therefore, I wouldn't speak of you, but my own level of expertise is far less than the level of expertise of a doctor, of an internist. I'm sorry.
One of the ironies of this show is it's about education as IT happens. And what we do find, and part of my film crew here today, is that we are in fact getting many, many opportunities to practice. And on that note, I'd like to bring it to a close, Henk. Thanks so much for being here. Okay. Your insights on education and learning have been extraordinarily valuable to me, and I believe to all the participants in our conference over this past week. Thanks.
Thanks.